Hi, welcome. This is period 2, the Transatlantic Trade. This is lesson 2.4, the Transatlantic Trade. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the causes and effects of the transatlantic trade over time. This is a pretty straightforward what caused the trade, what are the effects of the trade? Because as you know, the transatlantic trade during this time period unifies 3 continents: Europe, Africa, and North America, and it completely changes the world. So, obviously, for an effect, you can't just say it changes the world. You have to be more specific, but we're going to hopefully explain how and why it changed the world today. Let's move on to our very first key concept. This is all about the development. What caused the development of this transatlantic trade? The economies of Europe, Africa, and the New World were all inexplicably intertwined. So, this triangular transatlantic trade from Europe to Africa to the New World back to Europe is the shape of a triangle. So, the trade itself is referred to as the triangular trade because of the shape that it makes. As the colonies become more prosperous, England becomes more prosperous, thus creating a vast shipping network connecting the continents. The trade goods, each continent provided something very specific. The North American colonies provided raw materials and agricultural products. Tobacco was one of the biggest exports of the New World. Sugar, raw sugar, the sugar cane, timber from the trees in New England, molasses. So things that you can grow, things that you can cut down. What did Europe provide? Europe provided finished products, textiles, furniture. The trees that were hewn in New England would be sent back to England itself proper, fashioned into furniture, and then sent back to the New World. Glass would be another item. Books would be yet another item. So Europe provides finished manufactured goods. What Europe sends to Africa: finished products, textiles such as clothing and material, rum that they made from the sugar and molasses that came from the New World, and most importantly, weapons, guns, firepower was what Europe sends to Africa, where they would be traded for human beings. The Europeans, the English, would trade with African chieftains in the coast of West Africa, weapons for slaves. The enslaved Africans were then sent to the New World, where they were on a ship. Their voyage on the ship could last for weeks, and the time period that they spend on the ship is known as the Middle Passage because it's in the middle of Africa and the New World. They would be taken by force, by warfare, by West African kings, put onto giant slave castles on the coast of West Africa, where they would await their fate by boat. They'd be loaded on the boat, tightly packed in there, and the Middle Passage would take them to the New World, where the vast majority wound up on sugar plantations in the West Indies. They did go to other English colonies, especially the Chesapeake and Southern colonies. The transatlantic trade was vital to the survival of the colonial region. There was some intercolonial, the colonies trading amongst themselves, but the vast preponderance of wealth in the colonies was dependent completely on this European trade. They could trade goods unique to America, sugar, tobacco that they were growing. And once tobacco becomes popular in Europe, it's pretty much a done deal. It is one of the items in Europe that is of the highest demand. And the more people use it, the more they want it. So it leads to an increase in the slave trade because we need more slaves for these large tobacco plantations that are getting bigger and bigger with more souls, with more people, with more trade. So you start to see how this cycle. So that's the development of the trade. They were dependent on one another for the items that they produced. The continuing trade does increase the flow of goods. Native peoples have a very high demand for European goods, European textiles, the clothing, the material, European weapons, firearms, swords, also items such as silverware, things like that were very important to the Native Americans. And in order to acquire these European goods, the natives had to refine their own interior trade networks. So they had to begin going out deeper into the interior to get more furs, more goods with which to exchange in return for the manufactured European goods, the textiles and the firearms. So, what impact does this European trade have on native cultures? It's a huge threat to their native culture. If they start wearing European textiles as clothing, they lose their traditional clothing. There's lots of concern as well that rum, manufactured European rum, alcohol, was bringing great detriment to the Native American societies at the expense of Native cultures. So their whole way of life begins to change. Finally, when the Europeans start increasing their trade with the natives, it only seeks to increase the spread of disease. When they come into contact with more Europeans, they contract more European diseases such as smallpox, influenza, measles, which quickly destroy Native American communities. And they didn't even know they were contracting it. Finally, in the transatlantic trade, this is all about how the British government capitalizes on the colonies and how they want to get the colonies into their hierarchy so they can have greater access to the colonial wealth. So as the colonies grow in raw products, the tobacco, the timber, etc., Britain says we got to get our hands on a piece of that pie. We have to try to find a way to make them part of this larger British crown. The way that they seek to do that is an economic theory known as mercantilism. Mercantilism is the whole idea that the colonies exist to support the mother country financially. The nation state, the home nation state, is called the mother country, and that colonial interests are secondary to the interests of the mother country. So everything that you do for the mother country. Everything that you grow for the benefit of the mother country. So that's the idea of mercantilism. It's an economic theory. So how this is applied to the British colonies. We're going to rewind. The colonies were founded by many different groups for many different reasons. The English from the very beginning did not have a top-down hierarchical structure. Therefore, it was going to be a big change for the British to come in and impose their will. So at first, the British colonies were largely ignored. The British colonies flourished in this being ignored. However, once they started making more money, the British saw this as a way to control the profits. So the British passed a series of laws beginning in the middle of the 17th century. So the first law was 1651. There was lots of laws. Collectively, these laws are called the Navigation Acts. They were laws that were designed to control colonial trade. There was a Wool Act, an Iron Act, a molasses act, a sugar act. So there were different laws and different taxes pertaining to all of the different raw materials that the colonies produced. The acts required that all colonial goods were shipped directly to British ports. You could not trade or sell to the Spanish. You could not trade or sell to the French. All of these goods also had to be on British ships. Also, another final component of the Navigation Acts is that the colonists had to buy from the British, sometimes regardless of the price. You couldn't buy from the Spanish. You couldn't buy from the Dutch. You had to buy from the British. So this was increasing control. The Navigation Acts effectively cut off colonial trade with all other nations, which reduces colonial profits. However, it increases British profits, which is the whole purpose of mercantilism. So in order to enforce these navigation acts, the British began to take more direct control over their colonies. They began having royally appointed governors for each colony. They began putting tax collectors into the colonies. They began sending British soldiers to make sure that the navigation acts were enforced, which is a very, very big change, which leads to colonial resentment. They don't know why they have a royal governor. Why are these soldiers here? Why are there these increased taxes, and why are there tax collectors? So, that being said, it wasn't like the British were super, super strict. Frequently, the British were being preoccupied by engagements in Ireland and in Scotland. So it wasn't like they were micromanaging the colonies 24/7. So smuggling became a thing. Because the British were frequently lax in their enforcement, it only leads to the colonists feeling like they have greater control. More smuggling, more control. All of this, you know where it's going to go. It's going to go directly into the American Revolution. Once the British do decide, after the French and Indian War, to enforce the Navigation Acts, the colonists are super resentful. And that is our fast forward. It was during one of these periods of greater enforcement that the colonists rebelled and lays the founding blocks for the American Revolution. So to sum it all up, hopefully you are able to explain the causes of the transatlantic trade and the effects of the transatlantic trade over time.